All right, everyone, welcome back to our next day of the virtual sessions for the conference. So we're going to get started with Dr. Jasmine Wade coming from Sacramento State University, all the way in Pacific time. So shout out to you for joining us early. And you will be talking about Afrofutures from Oakland to Sacramento. So without further ado, Dr. Wade to the stage.
Thank you so much. Good morning, everyone. It's bright and early for me. Thank you all for being here. I specifically wanted to thank Dr. Lonnie Brooks of BSAM Northern California for sending me the call for papers and inviting me to present. I'm honored to be here amongst colleagues and friends. I don't have slides, mostly because I just want to talk to you all about a project I did with my students at Sacramento State. As Courtney said, the project Afrofutures from Oakland to Sacramento demonstrates how community engaged pedagogy can cultivate what I'm calling foresight resilience among Black youth in the face of climate chaos, digital surveillance, and systemic precarity. Foresight resilience is the capacity of Black individuals and communities to draw on personal memory, local knowledge, and broader historical patterns, recognizing the cyclical nature of history to prepare for and shape what is to come. It emphasizes Black agency over the future by refusing erasure, centering imagination, and transforming historical consciousness into strategies of survival and liberation. The Afrofutures Project specifically uses mentorship and leadership as a vehicle for foresight resilience, which I'm seeing as a really important skill for Black youth to develop for future innovations. In order to make sense of this, I am going to explain what we did. I'd like to introduce the collaborators. So Sacramento State University launched its Black Honors College in last year, the 24-25 academic year. And this initiative carved out a space for high achieving students interested in studying Black life history and culture to complete their general education requirements with that focus. And then the other partner is the Community Future School, which is a program operated by the Museum of Children's Art in Oakland. They're known as MOCA, so I'll probably call them MOCA from here on. MOCA goes into public schools and teaches students foresight skills in order to promote them to imagine a just future for Oakland. And so for those of you who are unfamiliar with the landscape of California, Oakland and Sacramento are about an hour and a half away from each other. Oakland's in the Bay, known as in the Bay Area, and Sacramento's in the San Joaquin Valley. So close, but not super close. In line with the conference proposal through this project, I am thinking about how important the imaginations of young people are to building just futures or making future waves. And much of this project is about the stories that students create about the future for themselves and their communities. So the plan for the rest of this talk, which I anticipate will be pretty short, is to talk about the theories that undergird this project, including work from Frantz Fanon, before going into the results and implications of the project. And I'll end by connecting my findings to foresight resilience and imagination in projects of liberation. So drawing from Fanon's insistence on youth as agents of revolution, I situate this project within Pan-African traditions that frame the imagination of young people as central to liberation struggles. In Wretched of the Earth, Fanon talks about the impact of colonization in Africa on the psyche of indigenous peoples, as well as the factors necessary for effective revolutions. He says, quote, "Each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it." Here, Fanon emphasizes that each generation has a role to play in revolution and nation building. Later in that same chapter, Fanon talks about how youth value, quote, "revolutionary impatience," and have an important energy to bring to liberation. He also argues that the political consciousness of youth needs to be cultivated and that they are the fighting generation, actively producing a new culture through their decolonial efforts. Fanon's ideas about the importance of youth in liberation struggles ties directly to Afrofuturist scholarship and activism's arguments of the necessity of the imaginations of young people in building possible and preferred futures. Three principles that are fundamental to the project that I did and informed by Fanon and Afrofuturists like Yatasha Womack are education, community, and liberation. Building on Fanon and drawing from Black radical traditions, as described by Cedric Robinson and Robin D.G. Kelly, educating the youth and prompting them to practice what they learn in their communities can position them for liberatory efforts. Fanon reminds us that youth carry not only the burden of colonial violence, but also the capacity to remake the world, a framework that grounds the role of Black imagination in the project. In this way, Fanon presents imagination as praxis in Pan-African studies, and I also apply this to Afrofuturism. So onto the project design, right? So in fall 2024, my students in Sacramento State's Black Honors College collaborated with the Community Future School, which I'll call CFS, through a semester-long pen pal exchange. They wrote 3 letters to each other back and forth, and then the students in Black Honors College served as mentors to MOCA's Community Future School. For most of the semester, they were pen pals, and then students in both groups, in the letters, they shared what they were learning in class, as well as like what college was like. All my students at Sac State were first years. So they were figuring college out and writing about like the transition from high school to college. And the Community Future School students were encouraged to share what they were learning about Afrofuturism and their plans for the futuristic prototypes they were imagining. After exchanging 3 letters, the highlight of this project was an in-person gathering at Sac State where the students deepened their relationships through conversation, games, shared reflections on Black futures. So the Community Future School students came to Sac State and hung out. They had a wonderful time eating together, laughing, and sharing more about their college experiences, asking questions. And this experiential learning activity and the reflections students did afterwards help them cultivate a stronger identity as college and college-bound students and share the knowledge of the class with, and for my students to share the knowledge of their class with community members. This project was designed to help students in both groups engage with their community futures and build on their existing foresight resilience. So where Afrofuturism served as both method and framework, enabling students to rehearse possible futures where Black survival, creativity, and resilience are not only imaginable, but inevitable. At the meetup, Sacramento State students shared their visions for the futures, the careers they're dreaming about, the businesses they're planning, the fun they want to have, as well as steps they've already taken to achieve those goals, and the college resources that they can utilize. The Community Future School students reciprocated by sharing their own dreams and goals, particularly their college plans. And one of the most fruitful aspects of the conversations were when CFS students would explicitly ask about the obstacles that Sac State students were facing on the roads to their proposed futures, and the students were like problem solving together. This prompted Sac State students to pause, problem solve on the spot in front of a younger audience. In a post-program questionnaire, one student said of the experience, quote, "It can kind of add motivation seeing how I was seen differently in the eyes of a younger individual." Another said, quote, "This experience helped me look back at the time I've had in college and learn how I've been using my time here to reach my goals." In addition to the reflective experience and mentorship and leadership can provide, another Sac State student said, "It was a reminder that I've earned my space as a Black Honors College student, and I have the capability of thriving through adversity." Through the program, the college students reinforced their foresight resilience by drawing on their personal memory and local knowledge to prepare for things to come. In the spirit of Fanon and Afrofuturism, this project affirms that youth imagination is a critical site of Pan-African struggle, one that prepares us for future waves of possibility and resistance. The pen pal exchange and campus gathering between Sacramento State and the Community Future School students demonstrated how foresight resilience is cultivated not only through envisioning liberatory futures, but also through the strategies, reflections, and relationships that make those futures tangible. In their conversations, laughter, and problem solving, students rehearse the work of imagining resources, anticipating obstacles, and affirming their capacity to thrive despite systemic adversity. For the Sacramento students, mentoring offered a space to recognize their own growth and claim their earned space in higher education. For the CFS students, the experience made college life both imaginable and attainable. Together, they enacted Afrofuturism as a living practice, one that transforms personal memory and local knowledge into strategies for survival and flourishing. This collaboration reveals how community-engaged Pan-African pedagogy can link generations and geographies in a shared struggle for liberation, ensuring that Black futures are not only imaginable, but inevitable. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that presentation. I did want to backtrack a little bit and just thank everyone for coming here and just spending time with us, whether you're coming from the Central Time Zone, Eastern, or Pacific. We appreciate you coming here to share time with us. And I did want to now provide everyone with the floor to possibly ask questions. I know personally I have some questions, or a question. That's all. And before I ask mine, I want to just provide everyone else possibly with the floor to ask if they have them. Okay. Okay. Well, oh, is that a, oh, I'm not sure if that's a question. So I think I'm gonna go ahead and mute. All right. I did have one question in terms of I've been thinking a lot about ways in which Black communities have been being policed more recently. And particularly Oakland's come into that conversation a ton, along with cities like Memphis. I'm curious as to how you are understanding Pan-African ideology, but also the MOCA project. Is that correct? Is that the titling of the project? And Afrofutures period to be in tandem with this narrative of policing that's being catapulted arguably onto Black communities, but arguably BIPOC communities as a whole.
That's a really great question. And that's actually something that came up kind of informally in this project where policing is an issue in Sacramento as well. And so students were talking about um, how it felt to be surveilled, right? That feeling of being constantly surveilled and how that impacted um, how they were imagining the future, right? And the different moves that they wanted to make. And I remember seeing like students. It's really interesting watching young people talk about this because I think they have like what Fanon talks about that revolutionary impatience, right? They are ready for this period of policing to just be over, and so there's this conversation about like how do I move in a way that keeps me safe but also allows me to realize my dreams. And I think that's something that I don't think they don't have answers to that. I don't have answers for them for that. But I think it's really interesting to watch to bring them together and have them have those conversations about safety as they try to realize their college and career dreams. I don't know if that answers your question, but it is definitely something that I'm actively trying to bring into the conversation for them.
Yeah, it definitely answers my question. And I don't think young people should have to answer those questions is the thing, but I think it's constantly something that they're thinking about and having to make sense of their reality in these really interesting times, to say the least. We have a question in the chat. How have you've worked with responded to I did something that's blocking that out. Responded to or incorporated elder wisdom Sankofa in the project? Nice question.
No, that's a really good question, and something that I've seen a bit of resistance to. Um, this a little bit of with amongst the students that I had in 24, 25, there's a little bit of resistance to elder wisdom, even a little bit of resistance from me coming in and being like, "What about this? What about this?" Like they wanted that mentorship space to be theirs, and even I think me trying to put certain aspects of the conversation in context, right? Where it's like, okay, we're talking about policing. There's a long history of policing in Oakland. Can we put what's happening now in 2020, what was 2024, in context of what was going on in the 60s, right? Or in the 30s even, right? Like, can we position it that way and have a historical lens? And there was quite a bit of resistance um, to that. And I it's interesting because Fanon kind of talks about that as well, right? This idea that the youth, um, what does he say? He talks about how there's this kind of resistance that youth will have to listening to the older intellectuals, right? And so I'm kind of seeing that play out or at least saw that play out last year. So I'm asking myself now, as I prepare to do it again, how I might approach that a bit differently, and add more, prompt students to have more historical context to what they're trying to do and talking about.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and we really appreciate all your thoughtful responses to the questions as well. I was also just thinking about technology in general and how it sometimes is pushing that resistance. And I think other generations are interpreting, for example, I'll use Gen Z as an example, Gen Z resistance as pushback when sometimes they're just wrestling and making sense of people and their reality and things like that. So I thought that was a really interesting point you made. And that revolutionary impatience point is a really good one. I need to dig further into Fanon again, it seems like. So thank you so much. All right. We are going to move forward with our program. I did want to add that there are 2 additional virtual sessions then listed on the website. So I will actually be presenting after Dr. Khadija George Sase, who's listed on the website currently. And then Cherie Renee Thomas as well will be joining us later on to provide a presentation as well. So the program will go a lot further than is listed on the website. But without further ado, we're going to bring up our next person, which is Isaiah Johnson. He is an independent scholar at Oberlin College, and today he's going to be presenting on the concept of dereliction or joy, reflections on Frantz Fanon and digital Blackness. So without further ado, to the stage, Isaiah Johnson.
Hello, everyone. My name is Isaiah Johnson. I'm a third year at Oberlin College. First of all, I just want to say thank you to Courtney, thank you to Dr. Wade, the entire BSAM community who put together this conference. I'm really excited to hear your ideas. So in a moment, I'm just going to share my screen because I have a little presentation to accompany my script. Can you guys see what I'm presenting? Yeah, okay, cool.
Right now, it just says you started screen sharing, so
Oh,
on the screen just yet. Perfect. Thank you so much. Now,
yeah, for sure. Can you still see now?
yeah, we see it. I see
Is
the
it
key.
not? Sorry, I meant to like to have a fit. Sorry.
You should be all set. If you go into
Okay.
present, it should work.
Yeah. Okay. It, can you see this?
Yeah, we see the enter full screen mode thing. So if you can X that out.
Okay. No, the problem is I don't have I need a script. Like my script is digitally.
Okay. Uh-huh.
If this will be okay to not have like on the full screen,
Yeah, yeah,
I
yeah, that's
sincerely
fine.
apologize. Okay.
That works.
Okay. Um all right. So without any further ado, this is Dereliction or Joy, for reflections on Fanon and digital blackness. So, amidst the global riptide of explosive decolonial uprisings throughout the global South, Frantz Fanon characterized decolonialism as a program of complete disorder. Fanon was watching firsthand the massive political upheavals that former colonies were making against the existing imperial structure that had been in place since the turn of the 20th century at least. Particularly paying attention to the Algerian struggle against the French colonial apparatus, Fanon analyzed and contributed to a palpable sense of urgency, uncertainty, and most importantly, radical hope and faith in a decolonial imagination. Fanon both contributed to and was shaped by this anti-colonial moment, becoming one of the most influential decolonial thinkers and activists of the 20th century. In 2025, however, our paradigm has significantly changed. Despite the political successes that many decolonial movements made in the 20th century, the material conditions of widespread economic inequality between the United States and Europe on one hand, and nations in Africa, South America, and Asia on the other, have persevered. This inequality grows more severe with every passing year, it seems. Though nations around the world enjoy nominal political sovereignty, the ever-expanding network of global capitalist development has maintained conditions of subservience quite reminiscent of colonial domination. Therefore, the political sovereignty that nations in the global South won in the 20th century seem insufficient to correct not only the economic plight, but the position of social inferiority that the people of these nations have been subjected to since the beginning of the modern age. As a trained psychiatrist, Fanon spent his career developing potent analyses about how colonial mechanisms of political and economic oppression are premised upon social and psychological codes, which fundamentally shape subject formation in both the colonizer and the colonized. Fanon's Black Skin, White Masks, which was published in 1952, provides much insight into these processes and how they materialize in the everyday lives of Black and Brown colonial subjects. In a new age where digital communities encompass a considerable portion of our everyday social lives, it's worth exploring the extent to which Fanon's analysis of the colonial subject formation remains applicable to the present day. How do the social and psychic effects of the white gaze, for instance, on Black interior life unfold across our digital sociologies? I think that Fanon's analysis in Black Skin, White Masks can help us work through these questions. These questions are ultimately about whether Fanon's work can be applied to our 21st century, or if the conditions that shaped the decolonial wave within which he was writing from shifted so radically that we should leave his analysis behind and find new tools to understand the complexities of racial, economic, and geopolitical dynamics that weave together our social fabric. I argue that though we do have to do the work ourselves to contextualize and translate, Fanon offers us an indispensable framework to understand racial capitalism today, particularly the social subject formations that emerge within this material system. To the digital age, I will contextualize Fanon's observations about the interpersonal and psychological dimensions of colonial subjectivity. How do white supremacist ideologies of neo-empire sustain themselves and mediate Black subjectivity as a regulatory framework, even in the absence of rigid colonial structures that were common a century ago? Does the power of such ideology unfold in the same way it did when Fanon was alive? And if so, what can his work tell us about how to best resist these powers? The digital space has reinvented social space. Via digital sociality, Black people enjoy newfound pathways to create novel forms of expression, political agency, and community. Does Frantz Fanon's conception of the white gaze, for instance, still have the implications that it did for Black in his day for digital Blackness today? We should first answer the question, what is the white gaze? What makes Fanon's analyses of colonial history viable in his social critique of these systems? In Black Skin, White Masks, Fanon gives us an important theoretical framework for understanding how colonial systems have generated racialized logics of personhood, and this is the white gaze. I argue that though independence and statehood might be post-colonial, it has not brought us actual decolonization because this gaze continues to be a defining theme of what Black subjects continuously navigate on an everyday basis. Contemporary Black scholars have already done a considerable amount of work in examining how the white gaze impacts Black subjects digitally. Andre Brock, for instance, published Distributed Blackness, African American Cybercultures in 2020, where he made an innovative analysis of how Black internet users navigate normative white supremacist structures to produce authentic and creative forms of self-expression and community building. Brock explicitly uses W.E.B. Du Bois's concept of double consciousness as a key driver of his analysis. However, I believe that much of his discussion intersects with and extends the theoretical frameworks developed by Frantz Fanon. Of particular importance is the emphasis that Brock places on performativity as a key process of how social identity is formed. By social identities, I'm defining both an understanding of individual personhood and the formation of boundaries between specific cultural communities. Brock importantly notes that all identity is racialized, gendered, and sexualized, and that these identities are created through the binary function of the particular performance that an individual engages in and how these performances are perceived by others according to their own respective identities. This conceptualization is implicitly inspired by Fanon's concept of the white gaze. Fanon asserts that colonial structures strip Black colonial subjects of the ability to create their own meanings of themselves and instead solely perceive themselves according to how the external white colonizing subjects are perceiving them. A point of departure between Brock and Fanon regarding performativity, however, is that where Fanon centers the white gaze in terms of physical embodiment, Brock points out that the absence of this embodiment occurs when entering the digital space. Does this point of distinction, the lack of physical embodiment or a disembodied digitized white gaze, have important implications for us as we use the internet? Does this digitized sociality significantly shake up the status quo regarding white supremacist practices and the potential for liberatory action? To say more about the white gaze, Fanon analyzes how colonial education systems serve as a key supporting mechanism for this oppressive political and economic apparatus to penetrate into the internal psyches of Black colonial subjects. Conceptions of truth are, in Fanon's words, quote, all white. In other words, colonizing agents create a world where white subjectivity is made both the norm and the standard object of universal desire. White subjectivity is literally everything. It is rationality, it is civilization, it's peace, prosperity, and fulfillment. Not only through education, but the entire system of social relations within colonialism trains its subjects to denigrate Blackness and pedestalize whiteness. Brock then extends this Fanonian analysis by highlighting how the different aspects of digital practice still preserve this universal white gaze as a core mediating factor that Black internet users are forced to navigate. He highlights how mainstream conversations about the quote digital divide, for instance, demonstrate that popular conceptions of what proper internet use looks like emulates particularly how white men are using this technology. From this point, it is clear to see that the lack of physical embodiment does not by any means curtail how whiteness remains deployed as a universal signifier of what is good and proper. Wide conventions of technology use are deployed as the benchmark for what constitutes productive or valuable internet use. Brock defines these deployments as quote, dogmatic respectability politics, unquote, which is about putting on an appropriate performance of Black modernity. It is a dualistic act of both policing Black people for acting inappropriate and policing white communities for believing that Black people are incapable of acting appropriately. In either form, this type of respectability politics is a drive to emulate white middle class norms, which are pedestalized as the utopian end for Black social practices. This white gaze is inescapable. It remains a totalizing framework that Black people are unwillingly forced to respond to and navigate. However, from these navigations, Brock brings to the fore many responses that serve as a positive assertion of Black agency and value. Citing Blackness Visible, a collection of essays by the late great Charles W. Mills, Brock says that Black folks survive within, quote, a racist paradigm through affirmations of self-worth and personhood and the recognition of racism with a militant insistence that others recognize it too, unquote. Brock defines this militant insistence as ratchetry. Ratchetry is a performance which emphatically signifies a refusal to apologize for or assimilate to notions of appropriate behavior and aesthetics. To use one more of his potent descriptors, ratchetry is, quote, incivility as agency, unquote. This is a powerful conceptual tool that allows us to understand the strategies that Black internet users provide to practically transgress the white gaze and build positive senses of self and community that is no longer bound by normative white supremacist value systems. Ratchetry facilitates the creative imaginations of Black internet users. People transgress the white gaze not merely through these uber performative expressions of authentic self, but through the myriad everyday forms of play, humor, and other acts that stem from inward-facing libidinal energies directed towards their allies within their own digital communities. The idea of ratchetry powerfully echoes the themes from one of the most significant sections of Black Skin, White Masks. In this section in particular, Fanon imagines a Black man who at once becomes aware of his, quote, carceral epidemiology, unquote, while the white other has bound him to, and takes decisive action to seize ownership of this epidemiology, telling a white woman who is racially goading him to, quote, kiss this handsome Negro's ass, unquote. 75 years later, Brock shows us how this moment continues to reverberate into our present conditions within the internet, particularly, where Black people positively assert and take control over what their Blackness means for themselves. It poetically demonstrates how important Fanon's words continue to be. Sorry, I skipped through that one slide. But in conclusion, the impetus that compelled Fanon to forge his legacy of calling for a decolonial revolution has not left our world by any means. There is more work for all of us to do, and the digital sphere will comprise a large portion of this work. In analyzing the internet, observing how racial logics of white supremacy are at work in this unique social space, and how Black subjects respond to these logics, we get closer to realizing what Fanon's vision for decolonial revolution looks like today. As enlightening as Brock's work is, though, it is limited in certain capacities. For example, it does not sufficiently address the inherent nature of neocolonial and capitalist systems to pacify new forms of resistance via commodification. What happens when performances of ratchetry turn into a social currency for capitalistic profit? Brock provides an important note of how, despite the ever-present systems of cultural commodification and appropriation, authentic Black sociality persists now and forever will, because, quote, Black folk enjoy being Black, unquote. Though this point is true and resonant, it is not sufficient in addressing fundamental injustices that remain present within the global structure. Yes, Black people hold an indomitable capacity for making a way out of no way, as Brock's concluding chapter is titled, but we still do need to be cautious about this ability and the capacity that this ability allows for one to become complacent while living within a structure that is actively oppressing racialized subjects all over the world. Brock demonstrated how Black people can create their own authentic forms of self-expression within a system attempting to extinguish the value of that authenticity. But I'm thinking about how easy it may be for people to ignore catastrophes like the genocide in Palestine, the rampant civil wars in the Sudan, or any other global paradigms of violence and inhumane suffering, which are the direct consequences of an oppressive regime of neocolonialism. What might Fanon say about the internet's ability to provide people with the mechanisms to forge new, robust solidarities with other colonized positionalities all over the world? How can Fanon's legacy provide us with digital tools to surmount the colonial apparatus which work to distract people and stall action that might materially disrupt the global hegemonic power that the United States and Western Europe enjoys? These remain potent questions that hold mountainous implications for those of us who are interested in materially and spiritually transcending the centuries-long history of white supremacist world-making that underwrite the material patterns of colonial expropriation and underdevelopment. Understanding how Black subjectivity remains a source of agency despite ever more pernicious forms of white supremacist subject formation in the digital age is a crucial starting point for answering these questions. Scholars like Andre Brock have shown us that the authenticity of Black interior life remains a positive form despite a digitized white gaze. Such Black transgressions will undoubtedly serve as a kernel for future political and economic decolonial action in the 21st century. So yeah, that's what I have. These are the works that I used. So yeah. Um,
Awesome. Thank you so much. Wow. That was a lot of food for thought. That was a great presentation. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Does anyone have any questions? I do have a unrelated question. Are you an undergraduate at Oberlin?
Yes.
In what department?
I'm double majoring in politics and Africana studies.
Okay, they're doing a fantastic job. That really puts Oberlin's Africana Studies department honestly on the map with what you just did. That was really fantastic. You did a
Thank you. I
great.
really appreciate it.
I wrote my dissertation on thinking about Fanon's white gaze to an extent, not really in the same way I would say, but I use a lot of that conceptualizing of digital blackness. But I hadn't seen Brock's work before, so I took a picture of that when you put it on the slide. It's a powerful piece, and I think you're asking some really dope questions, especially at the undergrad level. I mean, most people aren't even thinking about that as fully fledged adults. So definitely at the undergrad level, you're killing it. But I can ask some questions right now, but I'll let everyone else possibly have the floor if they want. All right. Since no one's asking a question, I'll go ahead and ask. I thought that last question you had about how Fanon's work is pushing us forward into this digital age. It's interesting. I do a lot of thinking about how like I'm actually presenting later on today too, but I think about how our everyday lived reality is really contesting a lot of these digital spaces, which I think you alluded to a bit in how you were talking about Fanon's work. So how are you really interpreting, thinking about the everyday reality that we live as humans and these digital spaces and how they're contesting one another in a white supremacist reality? I'm really interested in just how you are making sense of that yourself.
Yeah, so like kind of thinking about like these overlapping like digital communities and how they are like bleeding into like the physical realities. Um, just to ask for
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
I think like that was one of the questions that I was thinking about adding in this presentation was like Brock, for as good as his analysis is, kind of conceives as the internet as like this space that is like almost sectioned away from the physical world. So it's like how how does like the history of colonialism in the physical world then like bleed in and overlap with like these internet within the internet? I think that that's like a really important question, and I think at the same time, like the internet can to a certain extent provide us with like all of these really like fun ways to like escape from physical reality and like the history of like colonialism and like capitalistic exploitation. And I think that that works as like kind of a mechanism for capitalistic like preserving hegemony to prevent us from like asking important questions about like how we can break that system. So I think it's a tricky question. I think like
I think you answered it. That was smart what you just said. It's I think it's distracting, but it's bleeding in the same sort of aspect. Like it's simultaneously distracting and bleeding at the same time.
mm,
That's gonna give me something to sit with right now. I think that bleeding analogy is a powerful one for sure.
yeah.
All right, we've got some hands up. If folks can go ahead and unmute themselves and ask their question whenever you're ready.
Can we jump in? Is it our turn?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay. So I guess I wanted to ask a question to try to bring together um what you shared with us, Isaiah, with the former speaker. So one of the last questions that we were grappling with before we turned to Isaiah's presentation was about the question of Sankofa or turning back. And so I guess my question is about it's a question about generational knowledge, right? So you have this sort of these digital socialities that are really primed. There's, young folks are like natives to that sociality. And so my question is, how does, I guess, this proposal that you're pulling from Brock around about the ways in which these digital spaces kind of um, condition, like give us different ways of imagining what Black resistance looks like, is there room for that in tapping into, uh, I guess, pre-digital generational knowledge? And I think it's an important question to ask if we're using someone like Fanon, because, there's a lot in Fanon that makes him very suspicious of history. He says things to the effect of, well, which is why he has this sort of contentious relationship to negritude, right? There is nothing there to be found in turning back. And so we just have to leap into the future. But then you have this sort of very important question about Sankofa. So it's like a generational question. Like how do we pursue this sort of exciting, imaginative capacity of Black youth without kind of, throwing out resources that may or may not be equally as valuable. I hope that question makes sense.
Yeah, no, definitely. It really does. I think like the aspects of Fanon that kind of does away with like old conceptions of like of negritude um is important because it's addressing a really powerful history of, I guess, kind of creating your own mystified form of like native like blackness in a way that like never really existed and like is highly essentializing and kind of dehumanizing in its own sense in a different form from like how like white supremacist structures dehumanize black folk, but still dehumanizing because it kind of strips any real um, any real dynamism within like creating these new like forms of culture. But I think while we are trying to like break free from like the now, which is like highly unjust because it's like baked into like white supremacist neocolonial structures, what we're trying to break for isn't necessarily untied from like historical conceptions of like what personhood is. And I'm thinking like really about how African cultures, or in some some cultures in the African continent kind of develop ideas of the person that's deeply embedded to the well-being of like the people around them. And I think that that is reckoning with like a capitalistic conception of the individual that's completely unbeholden to like the well-being of others and highly kind of incentivizes you to maybe like put down the people around you for your own like well-being. And I think that that's like the core conception of personhood that has like developed this entire history of injustice that we're seeing now. So we're simultaneously trying to transcend into something new, but like revitalize an old conception of personhood that may have like developed some at some point way back when before, um, Europe started to use like African people as like inhumane forms of labor. It's broad, but I think what you're getting at is really, really important. And it's like kind of reckoning with like breaking from the now into the future and revitalizing some aspects of the past that doesn't kind of ossify us and, you know, remove any capacity for like dynamic creation.
Yep, that was a great response. And I would say to add on to what you were saying, I think your citation of Brock demystifies what the limitations of Fanon's argument inherently, right? Because Brock is leaning on a colonial interpretation of digitization to understand our current reality. And so that inherently leans on the past, right? So it already contests with a lot of what Fanon's talking about. So you're sort of inherently already doing the work, but I think it's really important to clash with Fanon's work because it was limited, right? The negritude movement too had its limitations. So it's important to highlight those contestations because they matter.
Yeah.
There's another hand.
Hey, Isaiah, great presentation. This was awesome. A lot to think about. I wanted to pull together two parts of your presentation. So I wanted to pull together basically the very beginning where you talk about our ability to like what kind of obligations do we have for extending Fanon in our contemporary age? But then additionally, sort of as we're extending Fanon, how is it that like we can be wary of a lot of the things that Fanon was wary about when he was talking about technology. And as you were talking, I just couldn't help but think about his description of the revolutionary power of radio. And like the way that the radio previously was thought to be something that was only an instrument for sort of colonial domination, but then was taken up by the Algerian liberation movement to be this means of sort of regenerating sort of a national liberation front. And so basically my question is sort of just like what do you consider to be these sort of digital spaces of resistance? Because the medium of radio is different than the medium that we face today. And it seems like I'm often very wary of things like social media as ways of like disseminating messages. So like are digital spaces of resistance things that need to be sort of invented or cultivated, or do they already exist? And do we have existing spaces of resistance within our existing digital community?
Yeah, that's a really good question, Justin. And I think that that's kind of what I was trying to get at towards the end of my paper when I was talking about how the internet kind of allows us to forge newfound forms of like global solidarities that really like are never before seen, because of just like how much capacity we have to connect with people on like in locations that were just not as easy as accessible before. But I think that like the spaces for this radical decolonial action already exists. I think it's all in like how we utilize the technologies that are present in our hands right now. It is what we make of it. I think that technology, I think technology in the sense reckoning with how limiting technology can be and how radical it can be, like striking at that balancing act is the same to me as people is the same thing that people have like imagined just like Western science and like rationality. Like historically, like yes, um you know, like the Enlightenment has produced like life-saving medications and life-saving technologies, but at the same time, it's like kind of created this form of like thinking of I'm losing myself, thinking of blackness as like inherently irrational, but there's still something there that can be preserved and like can be like recuperated and repurposed by us in a way that's positive. I think that like the road technologies that we have in front of us aren't inherently bad, but it's like the intrinsic psychic understandings of like the social world and like what how those technologies factor into the social world that needs to be changed. And like we do the changing by kind of trying to imagine new forms of utilizing what's in front of us. So it really is what we make of it, I guess. That's kind of like a, I don't know. It's a really important question.
No, thank you so much.
Great responses, really thoughtful to the questions you were asked. And thank you again for your very informative presentation for us for this conference. We are going to go ahead and move forward with our program. So next up, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Khadija George Sasay. She's from the International Black Speculative Writing Festival, and she is going to be talking about from colonial African tropes to futuristic African concepts, the change in emphasis on the winning stories in the Kane Prize for African Writing. All right, there you are.
Thank you.
No problem.
Okay, yeah, so my name is Khadija, and let me apologize first and say I'm not as prepared as I'd like to be. I'm going to be jumping around a bit. I'm not at home, but hopefully everything will all pull together by the end. So my presentation today looks at the changes in the past 25 years in African short storytelling in print, and how this has also led to changes in how African short stories are being published. I'm using the Kane Prize for African Writing to demonstrate this. When the Kane Prize started in 2000, it was groundbreaking in the sense that there was no other major prize for African short story writing at the time. The only other one, the major one at the time, was the Noma Award for Publishing in Africa, which ran from 1980 to 2009 with an annual prize of about $10,000 for outstanding African writers and scholars who published in Africa. So that was the main one at the time until the Kane started. And most of those who submitted to the Kane Prize at the time, when it was launched, were already published writers. They were already publishing writers. And so those ones who were shortlisted, nearly everybody knew who those ones shortlisted were because they were already published writers. Even though the main objective of the prize was to encourage and seek out new writers. Yet arguably what was emerging were new writers, but not new stories. As the late Binyavanga Wainaina penned in his classic essay, How to Write About Africa, there was no shift from these traditional stories that were coming out, well, the same stories that were coming out around politics, corruption, starvation. And that is what the judges were selecting. And most of the judges were not of African descent. Contemporary stories were being submitted, but not necessarily being selected as new stories from new writers. So, for example, myself and Helen Habila published a book called an anthology called Dreams, Miracles, and Jazz with Picador in South Africa. Nearly all mainly new writers, but there were some established writers, especially some who'd been published in Kane. Helen won the Kane Prize in the second year. So for them, he was like the kind of writer they wanted to be, that they were wanted to encourage. The first person who won was a published writer who was quite well known. So he won the second prize, and between us, we decided to put together an anthology of new writing. This actually included a story by a speculative fiction writer called BSAM, a Gambian writer. And the publishers came back and said they'll publish the book but we have to take out that story. They just didn't believe in the story. And we responded by saying, if you don't include that story, we'll just go and find another publisher, because to us, that was looking so much at what the future of African writing was looking at. And as these, so we presented this, the book did go in, we selected some of the stories to go in, including BSAM's, to be selected. This, I think, 2010, for the Kane Prize. And none of them even got shortlisted. And that was even kind of telling us that they weren't actually, even though their objective was to look for new writers and new writing, it wasn't actually working. It wasn't actually coming through. But using the timeline of how the changes have happened in the Kane Prize is very useful to see how these changes have been happening, since it's one of the most prominent prizes around. And it starts off as a short story prize, but it encourages writers to publish novels, so which is really good. And especially because, a lot of the submissions, the contributors are young writers under 40. When it started, it wasn't like that, of course, because there was a lot of published writers who already published anyway. And so as the years have gone by, a lot of the writers are becoming much younger. And it wasn't until 2020 that Erenison Okoji's story, Grace Jones, won the Kane Prize. It is a psychological trauma, which tells the story of Cedra, who finds herself working as an impersonator of the Jamaican singer, model, and actress Grace Jones. And this is like, we felt a real sea change happening in the acceptance that there was so much more variety in African storytelling. It was building, but we really felt that with the Renaissance story, it just kind of blew it out of the water. But also, it was happening with people like Binyavanga, as I mentioned, but he was more of a non-fiction writer. Anyway, so then what happened, like and the way this was progressing with this encouragement and acceptance of more broadly challenging stories coming to the forefront in something like the Kane Prize. In 2023, that prize made history with its first all-women judging panel, which included Dr. Farida Banda as chair, Jendela Benson, Warsan Shire, Edwidge Renidro, and I think it was the first time they'd had a judge from one of the Francophone countries, and myself. And out of almost 300 stories that were submitted, about 25% of them were of the speculative genre. So, it's almost definitely one of them were going to get it. And we didn't put the stories just because we were just looking for something different, because a lot of the stories is excellent writing across the board in different genres, but getting through 300 stories, and these particular stories really did stick out for all of us. But competitions are competitions, but they really did gel. So it was only at the end, and we were kind of selecting them and getting submissions, and we were realizing just how many of them were very strong in the speculative fiction genre. So out of the 5 shortlisted stories, 3 of them were speculative. One of them was Peeling Time, and she has to excuse me if I pronounce her name a little bit incorrectly, Totlo Tasmasi from Botswana. There was Daughters by Our Hands by Ekamini Pius from Nigeria, and A Soul of Small Space Places by Mame Brugama Diene and Wapa Diallo from Senegal as a husband and wife team. So that year was bringing up a lot of firsts. It's the first time they'd awarded a prize to a couple, to a story that was written by 2 people, and one that was actually written, selected from a country that was not specifically Anglophone as well. So there were a lot of firsts with coming out in 2023, and the richness of the story. So I'm just going to, for time, I will just say briefly what these stories are about. What was interesting about Ekamini Pius' story, which is called Daughters by Our Hands, was that it was set in a hair salon. It was also a nail salon, and the way that women were conceiving children was it was determined by the length of their nails. So it's like what women were doing is that they held the power in their nails. And so if they had 10 beautiful long nails, that was 10 beautiful children, long children, but they weren't necessarily having the children. They would sell their nails, and they would especially sell them to women who didn't have long nails. So it's a really interesting way of deciding this is where the power sat with women and the wealth. And this is the way they became wealthy as well. So the protagonist in this story, she decided that she wasn't going to sell her nails. She was going to give them away because she felt that there were women who deserved to have children who couldn't necessarily afford these extortionate prices of the nails. And it's a very interesting link to the fact that this was all happening in a hair salon as well. So I'm just saying briefly, I'd love to say more about that particular story. And it was interesting that this focus on women's Black body was done by this young Nigerian guy, and he is capturing these very essences around the hormones and around women, the fertility of women. And the story by Totolo, I mean, her story, I think we were captured more by the style of the way she wrote, as much as the story itself, because her style, it was very lyrical. And she said herself that when she was writing, she was inspired by rap music and rap lyrics as well. And there's so many twists and turns in the story. But again, what was the focus of it? And this was not just because the judges were all women, but the focus again was on the power of women and the way women retain their power. The winning story, A Soul of Small Spaces, it was captured. It was a combination of horror and myth, and the way that young girls being abused, especially like on their way home from school, there were young girls who were basically snatched by marauders and sexually abused, and throughout the story, you see these abusers then being ripped apart by who knows what at night. And so it's like, well, who is basically killing these men, and why are they being killed? And they're being killed because they were basically abusing young girls. It was horrific. It's a horrific story, but also, again, a story that comes down to looking at women and power and the way they have their power. So that's all I'm going to say about these stories, but you can see them on the website of the Caine Prize. So I'm going to move along, skip some of my things quickly because I want to talk a little bit more about the tropes. All of these, as I said, all three stories are carry warnings around women and power. And this itself is based in looking at the future concept of world leadership as well. And it's also given an insight into oncoming changes in publishing in Africa as well. Again, a lot of the publishing in Africa, a lot of the independent publishing is actually being done by women. And there's a book that has just recently come out. I'll see if I can put it in the chat, which is Conversations with African Women Publishers. But what is interesting, like when the Caine Prize first started, because it was 2000, they really wanted the books. People, the publishers had to submit books. You could submit online, but they were basically saying that the ones that were submitted online weren't being selected by the judges, which was really interesting. Now, all of them are being submitted online, so they can accept that many more, but it also opens it up to the fact that much more publishing in Africa itself is being sent for the Caine Prize, whereas before in 2000 it wasn't, because the publishing of fiction was very small, and so those books weren't getting out, and then they were having to send those books, like I think it was 6 books for the judges from Africa to England. It was just like, even that was expensive. So it's even changed, just even over that time, over that trajectory, that trope in terms of publishing itself has changed from the fact that it's strongly print, and that was restricting who could submit stories. So then who could be selected to the stories, to those ones now where it's online. So we're seeing in terms of the journals and the publishers in Africa are very strongly represented, whereas they weren't being done before. The other thing I want to mention, and please give me Host, please give me like a 1 minute heads up if I'm going too long. Another thing is around language, because of course it's a prize in the UK, and it's like, the stories have to be presented in English, standard English. That's how it was. It's been changing a little by little, because like, even for example, when myself and Helen published our anthology, it was like more writers were including words in mother tongue, words in a second or third language, usually an African language, sometimes French, sometimes Spanish, but mainly in different African languages. And that has now progressed. And when we were publishing those stories, we had a glossary. Now it's changing. The stories that we're reading, especially like, for example, in the Caine Prize, and the stories we were reading, they were using mother tongue, especially increased in dialogue, and they were not using any glossary. That's another change, another really positive change as well, is that they felt that their stories were strong enough and the writing was strong enough to say that we're not putting it using a glossary, and we're not even going to put the translation into brackets. This is the story, and people have to get it like that. So that is another change from a colonial trope to what is happening in the future with African short stories. And I will stick to saying it's short stories, because obviously the novel is different altogether. And the other change that is being used, or the other change that we're kind of seeing, are the way that people are using social media platforms. So, for example, we had this story that came out in the UK bookseller saying how much more people are now reading short stories. I think they always were. They weren't in England. They always kept pushing the novel. But we know that in other countries they were using the short story a lot more. So I think we're going to see also a change in how the stories are going to be presented. And it may in some ways go back to stories, or even like novels, being presented in series format, especially if they're online or whatever. And so stories are being presented, longer stories being presented in a series, rather than just in one long story. I think the novels are still going to be read, but I think they're going to be presented differently. And especially because it's much easier and cheaper, especially for African storytellers, to get their work out online, because they can do away with those expensive publishing costs. I think actually I've covered most of my points there. And I'm just looking at the time. So I think I'll stop there and just open up questions. Thank you.
Yep, we're going to open the floor for questions if anyone has them. If no one has any questions, I'm interested in thinking about, when I think about the Caine Prize for Writing, I think a lot about Ngugi wa Thiong'o's work in terms of thinking about language and decoloniality. So how are you conceptualizing what you've discussed with language and decoloniality as Ngugi wa Thiong'o postulates it?
Okay. Rephrase that for me again.
Yeah, you talked a lot about language for sure, and thinking about your work. How are you positioning Ngugi wa Thiong'o's notion of decoloniality and how language plays into your work? I'll also just give a bit of a summary about sort of what he talks about. He talks about how when we used, quote unquote, the master's tongue, quote unquote, colonial language, we replicate coloniality to an extent. So how do you think that plays into what you discussed today?
Well, look, I think what Ngugi would then come to eventually, I mean, he would call himself a language warrior. So he wouldn't talk about African language in exclusion to writing in English. He would say that we should use, if English is your language, for example, is the only language you speak, then, you use that to its strength, but you do not put it in any superior level to anybody else's language. And then, of course, if you do have more than one language, which language are you calling your mother tongue, and which language do you express yourself in, and which one is your strength? And you can use, especially when you are multilingual, and as so many African people are, you can use all of them, in fact. And I know, for example, they have done when I've worked with poets in Gambia, and then they'll be doing spoken word, and there'll be like 4 or 5 languages in there, you know, and things like that. And so one of, for example, my thing has been working with poets in particularly, but even working with fiction, is to encourage them to use whatever languages that they do have. And talking about why that is important, because we were really fortunate enough, and Gugi came to the festival that I organized in the Gambia in 2017. And we kind of really, and one of the reasons why he came was the short story that he, you know, had published in like 100 languages. He said, "Can you publish this in Gambian language?" I said, "Of course," you know. I said, "Yeah," before I even started it. So we published it in 4 languages in one book. And so we were basically saying that for young people to then, even if they didn't speak very great English, they could speak at least one of those languages in that book. And we're kind of saying that was for them a strengthening of their identity, a strengthening of their own power, to see somebody like Ngugi, who they have to read in school in English, then writing his story in their own tongue. That was a sense of power. So that is the way we're using it, and that's the way we're encouraging that this is your own power by using your own language as equally as English, and without saying that English needs to be all French, needs to, you know, surpass your own mother tongue, and to encourage to use it. And that is why it's great to seeing more stories now where they are using it, especially with dialogue, and with no glossary. Does that answer?
Yeah, and thanks for that correction. I think Ngugi wa Thiong'o's work is really hard to ever put into a sentence, but I think that that's a great point. I now remember, when I think about it, that he was understanding how in many Kenyan schools the positioning was to posit European literature as central into how they interpret literature and things like that. But he really was bringing Kikuyu to the centerfold and seeing its power like that.
As they do throughout most of the continent. But I think for him as well, the most important thing was that not so much as well that they were positioning the European literature above their own, but they were punishing the children if they even spoke mother tongue, or if they wanted to use a mother tongue. And so of course that made them feel like, well, this is a worthless language.
Yes.
Do you know? And that's what he was kind of fighting against. And also he also said at one stage, which is really interesting, is that when he was jailed for some of his work, it wasn't necessarily for the content of the work, it was for the fact that he wrote it in Kikuyu. So for them to say, well, okay, well, if you write in Kikuyu, how's anybody going to understand it? It obviously is not that important. Well, of course it was, if you're jailed for it. If you're jailed for it, that goes to show you how important it was. You're being jailed for speaking your mother tongue.
Yeah.
So that was also part of
it. And I mean, I've seen some things in Tanzania where I've done my research where they still have like signs hammered into trees to speak English for the young people. So it's still this language of coloniality happening in our modern day, so to speak.
Exactly. Yeah.
Someone has a hand up, and in the chat, there's a question. Can you remind us where we can find these stories?
Yeah, if you go to the Kane Prize for African Writing, each year is still, they have the shortlisted stories for each year is still on their site.
So yeah, thank you. That was actually my question in the chat too. And thank you for your presentation. I was curious because I was hearing a through line through all 3 presentations, and thinking about that idea of like looking back to look ahead. As the medium for storytelling can evolves, especially from like print to digital. Could you talk a little bit about some of the possibilities for multimedia storytelling and how that maybe opens up new liberatory spaces?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, in some ways, I don't think it's like because I will go to the London Book Fair every year, which is like, you know, it's a trade fair, but they're doing more stuff now for writers as well, which is really important. So I tell writers they need to go to the fair to understand the industry you're in, so it doesn't freak you out. And I think publishers were, first of all, they were really wary about social media. It's like, this is taken us over. Now they're using it so in such a vast way, but publishers use it to promote their book. They use TikTok and they use books. Is it Booktogram or something? They use it so much. So when you go to the London Book Fair now, when you're hearing how these they're being used, these are all young people under 30 on these panels. And the rest of us, how to use these as the power of books. And they are building networks of readers in a way that was not done before, in a way that wasn't used before. So hearing this whole thing like young people don't read is absolute rubbish, because of course they do. It's the way you give it, and I've always said that's rubbish. It's the way you give it to them to read. That's what is different. So the way that maybe we read, and I'm still a print person, I don't even hardly do audio. But audio is, and we were getting figures of just how big audio has become. And what is good about the audio, it uses a lot of backlist titles, whereas a lot of print publishers will not print backlist unless they're going to get a massive sales thing for it. I mean, like people like Walter Rodney, yeah, great backlist, and they will publish Walter Rodney and on these anniversary dates because they know that people are going to buy the book and they're going to use it. Whereas the audio market, they are saying about 35% of their sales come from backlist, which is quite huge, I think. So so it's, you know, it comes from the titles that were published that might be out of print in book, but are still popular for a lot of people. And so they select the ones, and that's where a lot of publishers are now making the money. And that is where some of the titles that we think that young people might not have heard about, it's being rejuvenated and they're coming through those kind of book lists. So audio has become quite big, and that's why I was talking about this books becoming series, because of course, like with social media, maybe online, having one very long text online is not the way it's going to go, but it will come in bite-sized chunks in terms of when I suppose we'll have more research done on what people's favored reading lengths is, and that's the way then the books will be chopped up for people to read. That's what I think. But there are also really some imaginative things. There was something that came out a couple of years ago, and I'm not sure what the people who were doing it, what happened to it, but they were kind of working on a method of publishing books through the browser. So this was really going to be helping people in developing countries because they didn't have to buy the book. They just needed to put the link in the browser. And so the books are going to become more interactive because it's not just going to be the text. It's going to be the book coming alive through the images and through sound. And that's where that kind of technology is going as well. So it's looking at things in a really exciting way of how a book production. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your questions, and thank you so much for all of your thoughtful responses to all of the questions. We are going to go ahead and move forward with our next presentation in the program. So up next, we have none other than Patricia Ndombe from Temple University. She's currently a graduate student at Temple University, and she is going to be presenting today on features of the classic African aesthetic and Kariamu Walsh Asante's Pan-African aesthetic in contemporary Afrocentric poetry within African futurism and Afrofuturism 2.0. So to the stage is Patricia Ndombe.
Thank you. Everyone, please give me a second as I share my screen. I will try to keep the presentation in the time that was allotted to me. So let's see. Slow. Let me try again. All right. As my screen is booting up, and hopefully you can see the slides on my screen. The long, chunky title, thank you, Dr. Card. The long, chunky title is essentially a way of saying, I want to spend a few minutes with you all looking at the classical African aesthetic, what our ancestors on the continent before Arabic and European colonization, what they thought of in terms of what they thought of as valuable, what they thought of as beautiful, what they thought of as moral, worthy, in looking at aesthetics, and how that can influence, for those of us who do write poetry, how that can influence and shape our poetry writing in a more Afrocentric manner. And then also placing that Afrocentric poetry within two avenues or two spaces for that poetry to shine best in a more located and centered manner. So I think in a lot of ways, this presentation is going to be in communion a lot with Dr. George's presentation previously. But again, I'll try to keep things brief and concise. First, we'll be looking at literature as a discipline. It's a mission of pre-colonial continental African literature. And then we'll look at why orature as a term is more inclusive for the works and texts, whether they were written or oral, from our ancestors, why that fits more so in orature than literature itself. I'll briefly share some features of the ancestral African worldview and matriarchal deep structure. And we'll be looking then at how those three we'll be looking at how those three influence the classical Pan-African aesthetic, which is it's been in our cultural consciousness since time immemorial. But Dr. Karyamu Walsh Asante, definitely, I believe, the first to coin and kind of structure the aesthetic in a way that makes sense for lots of different arts and arts forms. We'll be looking at her seven senses in the aesthetic, and then we can look at how Afrocentric poets, Afrocentric literary artists at large can use the seven senses and the aesthetic at large in writing an Afrofuturist and African futurist modes in the future. Okay, so we come to and this is ongoing, but we come to 17th and 18th century Eurocentric academia combating not only African literature or African orature at large, but also the African human experience and Africans in general. In the 1600s and the 1700s, and again, onward, you find many Eurocentric scholars, such as the German historian and philosopher Hegel. You see them make the argument that because Africans were the most primitive and the least advanced form of human beings, in terms of the global human experience, that there was no way that our ancestors could have been advanced enough to write to begin with, let alone write enough to produce collected bodies of literature. In his lectures on the philosophy of the world in 1775, so again, same century span, Hegel even says the characteristic feature of Negroes, we can argue that to be Africans in general, is that their consciousness has not yet reached an awareness of any substantial objectivity. They have, he says, but they could not become aware of their own being. He describes us as undifferentiated, knowing nothing of a higher power, of an absolute being, and us living, especially our ancestors, us living in a state of savagery and barbarism, and that's the way it's going to be.
How are you? Yo, Courtney, how are you? I had challenges with electricity in South Africa, so I had to like go to my other friend who as well.
Okay. So yes, again, 1600s, 1700s, you find a lot of Eurocentric scholars making the argument that there could be no collection of African literature, especially that coming from the continent, because our earliest ancestors were extremely primitive and we were only beating sticks together, dancing around a bushfire, and we couldn't write. So in contrast to those very racist claims, we find before Arabic and European colonization taking place in the 7th and 15th century, starting in the 7th and 15th centuries, respectively, we see the exact opposite. We see our earliest ancestors on the continent producing not only written texts, and not only oral works, but works of both modes. And this is why orature fits more so for in describing our collection of classical works. Orature fits more so better than literature, because literature is essentially the collection or a body of written works coming from advanced societies, whereas orature, coming earliest and most notably from Pio Zirimu and Ngugi wa Thiong'o, we can think of orature as being a collection of both oral and written African texts that were designed pretty much for oral transmission and performance. So yes, written works, they fit here as well, but also plays, poems, speeches, tales, things of those of those natures would also be they would find more so of a home in orature than literature. And specifically for this presentation, as I said, when we're thinking about pre-colonial continental African orature, we're thinking of oral and written texts, working primarily through an oral mode, and those texts being written or those works being spoken before the 600s and the 1500s of the Common Era. And in orature itself is a huge genre, but specifically for African orature, you find other subgenres like the sacred, wisdom, works and texts, creation mythology, ethics, tales, and others. So these subgenres, they don't look like poetry as we would see, on a piece of paper today, pretty much left or middle margin. But these subgenres of orature, they were definitely poetic in essence. And this is what I would argue Afrocentric poets and literary artists at large should definitely be welcome to tap into for their own creativity. Okay. Again, we find a lot of Eurocentric scholars from the 17th and 18th centuries making the argument that we and our ancestors primarily could not have had a collection of written works or a culture because we barely had any humanity to begin with. Again, you see the exact opposite. And this is not to say that, on the continent and in the diaspora, we as a collection of peoples do not have individual unique cultures. This is not to say that. What this is saying is that those Eurocentric scholars, essentially, they were wrong. That at the foundation of our unique and individual cultures, we find in the deep structural matrix these features of the African worldview and African matriarchal culture. So I've listed here on this slide and the next one, I believe, some features of both the African worldview and classical African matriarchal culture, which you can find in just about every continental and diasporic African subcultural group, contemporary and in the past. Again, we are all unique. We're going to have our own different cultures, but these are our foundations. And I'm not going to read all of them. I'm just going to list a few. Centrality of the community, communal life experience, respect for tradition, high levels of spirituality, ethical concern, us maintaining harmony with nature, us respecting and venerating our ancestors, the multi-dimensionality of our being, the interconnectedness of our being, a call for harmony between women and men, not the female subjugation by the male or the opposite, understanding nature of life through living in community, personalism, pursuing and maintaining a virtuous character, and other features. So again, we have thousands, millions of unique continental and diasporic African cultures, but what you often find at the heart of those cultures are these elements. And it is these elements which are also at the root of the classical African aesthetic. Aesthetics can be defined as the branch of philosophy that deals with beauty, the beautiful, what is tasteful, and how we value and how we judge what it is that we find tasteful, beautiful, worthy, things of that nature. Dr. Karyamu Welsh Asante, in my humble opinion, stands out to me in terms of surveying scholarship on African aesthetics, global African aesthetics. In an article that she wrote entitled The Aesthetic Conceptualization of Zuri, she says that the cultural dynamics of a people create a specific aesthetic complexion. So by nature of the fact that our ancestors had specific cultures and had a cultural matrix that united them on the continent before they left into the diaspora in different ways, for the very fact that we have a culture, we have cultures and a deep structure of culture, that means we also have a particular aesthetic that flavors our human experience. And Dr. Welsh Asante said that all African cultures express themselves through dance, music, visual arts, and graphic arts. She is a legend in the in dance and in the performance arts in general. I am simply making the argument that just as much as African culture emanates through the African aesthetic in these sorts of arts, it can also do so through the literary arts. I'm focusing mainly on, poetry, but you can extend that to different other literary genres. In her article and in another text that she wrote called African Culture, the Rhythms of Unity, Dr. Welsh Asante, she sort of puts the classical African aesthetic in contrast with the European or the Eurocentric aesthetic, and in seeing how they differ one from another. These are just the main takeaways of, in terms of if you are experiencing whatever kind of art it is, you will typically find these emanating at the heart of those arts, whether it's in form or in structure, or for literary arts, in its production and its craft. these were typically what our earliest ancestors were going for in their own artistic production. And I won't list all of them. I'll just pull one or two. In the European mode, we hear art for the sake of art a lot. Dr. Welsh Asante said that wasn't typically how our ancestors went about producing art. They usually went about producing art recognizing that that art had to serve a function. That art had to create life and exchange life, not only for the speaker or the reader, but also for all of those who may be listening or reading whatever or experiencing whatever art form it is. So it's not just let's let art be what art wants to be, but in the African understanding, it's this art, I am producing this art, the artist would say. I am producing this art so that it benefits not only myself, but the people around me and makes their lives better. Another sort of principle in terms of the African aesthetic was that there was no separation between religion and state. You find many African civilizations before Arabic colonization in the 600s, you find the spirit and spirituality interconnected with everything: economics, politics, education, family, all these institutions. Spirituality and religion was at the heart of it all. You don't find that necessarily in the European mode, but you definitely do find that in the aesthetic mode, in the African aesthetic mode. Dr. Welsh Asante says, and that is something that if you do strive to be an Afrocentric artist, you know, poetry, literary, or whatever other genre, that is also something that you should embrace and not try to separate. And finally, another route being the artist. Well, no, I already said this. The artist was an integral occupation in the community in terms of transposing creativity from the divine in order to benefit society as a whole. Now, in terms of Dr. Kari, this is one picture of her. In terms of her coinage and her reinvention, her revisualization of the classical Pan-African aesthetic, she determines 7 senses. Those 7 senses she mainly applies to dance and performative art because that is her area of expertise, and well so. But again, I'm arguing that for Afrocentric artistic modes, whether it's performance, visual, modeling, literary, whatever have you, if it's operating from an Afrocentric perspective, so, you know, wanting to make sure that it itself is grounded and centered in African cultural history, if you have an art form performing in that space, it is also going to emanate these 7 senses. I'm focusing mainly on poetry because that's what's special to me. The first sense she calls polyrhythm. What's most important from these very thick quotes you see in bold, but the first being polyrhythm is essentially her way of capturing the simultaneous rhythms that take place within an art form and emanate from an art form. It comes with the recognition that just as much as Afrocentric art, whether it be poetry or otherwise, just as much as it also captures various rhythms, we also as human beings, we move throughout the world walking through and being cognizant of different life forces and rhythms that are around us. Now, this makes 100% sense for dance, but you can also see rhythm being implemented in poetry as well, and multiple rhythms in the experience of a poem. You can see that as well. The second sense he calls polycentrism, and it holds movement as motion spending time, not just going from one point to another. And in my previous studies of poetry, I also found that to be the case in African-centered or Afrocentric poems that I've experienced. And polycentrism in Afrocentric poetry, it can look like having to balance decisions toward line length, syllable count, deciding what kind of line you want to incorporate, incorporating rhyme scheme, incorporating caesures. All of these things are decisions that a poet has to make in determining how much time, not only how much time they want their poem to take up an experience, but how they want that time to flow. So that's the second one. The third sense, Dr. Welsh Asante calls curvilinearity, and that's essentially making sure that because our ancestors highly regarded the circle as a symbol of well-roundedness and completion, we as Afrocentric poets and literary artists at large, we also want to make sure that we have that same curvilinearity in our own work. So different craft choices in that regard, maybe making sure that the journey of our plot in a poem is well-rounded and complete. We want to make sure that themes are incorporated well throughout, and interconnected symbolism and imagery. Again, these are all decisions that poets and Afrocentric poets have to make in trying to keep in line with the African aesthetic and making sure that their poem is at whole curvilinear. The fourth sense, dimensionality, that is mainly for the poem. That's that little something that you feel, that resonance that you feel after you've experienced a masterfully crafted poem. It might be satisfaction. You might be feeling some type of way. It might be, a question that you have, a memory that's invoked. But whatever that resonance is, that is dimensionality that can be experienced in Afrocentric dance. The fifth sense of the African aesthetic is epic memory. It's essentially utilizing motifs, themes, transgenerational memories that are subconsciously and consciously passed down throughout different generations. And it is epic memory, she says, Welsh Asante said. It is epic memory that essentially keeps us in communion with our ancestors because we are writing in that same mode. We have been granted permission to write by tapping into and utilizing epic memory. So this is another sense that Afrocentric poets and literary artists can make sure that their work embodies. The sixth sense, holism, it's kind of similar to curvilinearity. But holism is making sure that each element in your poem, or whatever art at large, but each element in your poem and all of the elements together are functionally working well for the experience of the poem. And the last sense for Afrocentric poets and literary artists at large to pursue in their own work is repetition. And this is repetition as not just repeating for the sake of repeating, but repeating to highlight something that you want to emphasize, repeating to amplify sound, repeating to intensify an emotion in a moment in your work. This is also one such sense. Now, finally, in the opportunity for Afrocentric poets, literary artists in general, in their utilizing African matriarchal culture, in utilizing the worldview, in utilizing the African aesthetic, here are two avenues in doing so in the contemporary sense, with one being African futurism and the second being Afrofuturism. African futurism as a theory comes earliest, again, it's been in our cultural consciousness since time immemorial, but it's coined earliest from Pamela Fatimo Sundstrom. And they essentially reinvent African futurism as using imagination as a political tactic for restructuring experiences of the African present through the imagining of new African futures. So with African futurism, you are not only reimagining the past, reimagining a better past for us and our ancestors, but you're also looking to the future, imagining what a better future might look like for us, and therefore taking ownership of that future. And what better way to do that in an African centered manner than than with the classical African aesthetic? What better way to ground yourself in that regard? And finally, Afrofuturism 2.0 invites Afrocentric poets, literary artists, artists at large who are utilizing the classical Pan-African aesthetic. Afrofuturism 2.0 is basically inviting us to look into the deep cultural structures around us, looking at those values which we retain, the ones that we pass on to those that we love, our future generations, looking at what can be held as truth in those and what might need to be let go in keeping up with the times. It is very much meta modern in that regard. But yes, it invites us to investigate deep transgenerational cultural structures of the world around us. And there are multiple modes in Afrofuturism 2.0 that you operate in. Obviously, with the classical African aesthetic, we're focusing mainly on the aesthetic dimension. But you have an integration of a lot of things at play. You have metaphysics, different sciences, social sciences, programming, and the list continues. But this is mainly Afrofuturism as being an avenue for Afrocentric poets and artists in general to utilize the classical African aesthetic. I am going to stop right here. These are my sources. They start on this slide, they continue here, and they end on this slide. And I thank you very much for your attentiveness.
Thank you so much for your presentation, Patricia. Now we're going to give the floor to the audience and see if they have any questions. If you could stop sharing your screen, that'd be awesome as well. Perfect, thank you. All right, any questions from the audience? I can also ask a question if no one has one before we move forward to our next presenter. Perfect. So I do have a question. So I was really fascinated by thinking about how time conventions get disrupted through poetry, particularly thinking about how I would argue that traditional Eurocentric poetry follows traditional chronologies anyway, too. Like it follows particularly like Eurocentric poetic rhythms. So I think there's that element. And then I think what you described about this notion of like resonance when people feel poetry, I think that also sort of disrupts the conventions of time to feel something in this inward way. So I'm interested in having you talk some more about that. And I was also going to mention, I thought a lot about Sinners and thinking about how when Preacher Boy started playing that guitar, that art itself kind of disrupted and collapsed time in a way. So just wanted to bring that to the forefront. So, yep.
Yeah, I'll try to answer as concretely as possible, but it might get a bit abstract. In thinking about, if we back up to like ancestral African cosmological understandings of time, our ancestors, and therefore we very much avoided this. We are going to take up time by A, B, C, D, E, and so on. I think there's a multi-dimensional aspect in understanding time that our ancestors knew that those of the European continent may not have completely understood. And in thinking about time, I from at least early, and I'm thinking of like even as far back as like Nile Valley orature. I'm thinking of time and especially rhythms in time, playing with time. I don't know if this is making sense, but time and rhythms of time, playing time, so that you not only have so it's not only a progression through time, but it's also you're taking up um different dimensions of time in order to share an experience, to capture an experience. So I feel like time, rhythms of time, and even what's the other sense? Um, uh, yeah, time, rhythms, and times, and like polyrhythms. When you hear the way that, for example, in an oral work, the way that your artist is able to craftily speed up or slow time by doing different things in their cadence, doing different things in their tone, doing different things, in regards to like line length, and all of that happening simultaneously. It's a lot more than just, A, B, C, D, E, because you're essentially grabbing, as time is progressing, you're grabbing different rhythms from different patterns of life around you, and you're weaving them into the poem's experience. And I don't know if that concretely answered your question, but that is the best way that I can, at least in my experience of like Nile Valley orature, that is according to my experience. What was your second question?
I think that was a great response. I think I was getting at exactly what you started talking about, that Afrofuturism really sort of disrupts time and space continuums. And I think you got into that when you talked about how the speaker or the poet themselves, in addition to the poetry, is disrupting time and space by how they choose to execute the poetry. So
Yes.
I thought that was a great point.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your presentation. We're going to go ahead and move forward with the next person in our program, who is coming from all the way from South Africa, Johannesburg to be exact. And Nyana Michael Damini is a graduate student at the University of Witwatersrand, or Wits. I know it's Wits in that space, and coming all the way from Johannesburg, and is going to be talking about a screening of Zulu Zula. So we're going to go ahead and bring them to the stage. I think they came out of the Zoom just now, so we're going to give them a bit of a second to gather back.
Hello, Courtney?
Yes. Are you back? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm back here. I was struggling with electricity in South Africa. There's a term called load shedding. So electricity can mysteriously disappear. I was in Joburg in a festival called Avijozi. Avijozi is one of the biggest festivals in Johannesburg about gaming, digital arts, VFX. So I was attending that festival. They were teaching us software, which are usually taught by to people in the north. So these skills such as Confa UI, AI, AI learning, data set teaching skill, like to teach machine learning in South African languages or indigenous languages. I was attending that conference. So for the screening, I'm gonna improvise. I went to as a proper Afrofuturist. You have to improvise on the spot, you know. So my study with
Perfect.
Afrofuturism
Sorry to
came with.
interrupt. Are you
Sure,
do you plan on doing a screening of a film?
Yes.
Okay, do you have the link to the film and are you able to possibly email it to me now? I can also screen it on my
Yes.
screen.
Yes, most definitely, because I was struggling with that. Now I'm using my friend's phone. I'm gonna send it through chat now.
Okay, that would be great.
So the film is inspired by Baba Credo Mutua. There's a writer. Is known, but he's quasi known. Please write his name down. Credo Mutua is South African based. And Courtney? Okay. Not sure.
Yep, I'm here.
Okay, yeah. So he has a book called Indaba My Children. It talks about speculative African mythology. So he talks about the character called Luzwimondi. Luzwimondi in the book, he wrote this book in the 1970s. Luzwimondi is called the Bantu of the Bantu race who's gonna be born in the distant future. So Credo Mutwa talks about African mythology in ways that are so shocking because it talks about the universe, but in African cosmologies. You know. Yes, I'm posting the link on chat now. Then I'll explain after.
Okay, are you sending it to my email?
No, I'm sending it through chat.
Oh, perfect. Even better. Perfect. Okay, is it okay if I click into it and share it on my screen?
Yes, most definitely. Please
Okay,
do.
I'm going to go ahead and mute you to do that. So
Yes.
the link didn't work. I just tried it. Hello? The link didn't work. Can you email it to me possibly? You're also muted, so I'm not sure if you're saying something, but I can't hear you.
Excuse me for that. Excuse me. Like I'm improvising. I don't have electricity in my neighborhood. So even this moment, it's a feat, you know. That's why I'm like, shout out to Afrofuturism. Like we actually living in the future as African people in the diaspora. Our daily lives, there are things that happen that have become so miraculous, even this moment to me, you know. So I'm gonna send it through email. I'm gonna tell you what I'm doing. I'm on my friend's phone right now. I'm gonna send the information through WhatsApp. Then I'm gonna like it's a complicated story regarding my Wi-Fi access. But give me like 5 minutes. I'm gonna be finished now. Mm, mm. And I thought I was gonna present my slides in case, but let me check. Please bear with me, guys. Please bear with me.
Yeah, no worries at all.
Okay. Mm, mm, okay.
I can
Okay.
also, I'm not sure if it will be be better for you, please feel free to let me know. But I can also present my PowerPoint for now. And then
For now.
send me the film via email.
Okay.
And then I can bring it up on my screen and share it once I get it, if that works for you.
Yes, most definitely. Thank you for that.
Okay. So should I move forward with my presentation and then we'll swing back around to you once you send it to me via email?
Yes, Courtney.
Perfect.
Please, yes, please. Thank you.
Perfect. Sounds good. All right. All right. In the spirit and name of improvising and in the best interest of everyone's time, I definitely am interested in seeing Zulu-Zala, or Zuzula. So we're going to spin back around to that once we get it sent. And yes, I think that was, as I am gathering my content to share my screen, I will say I think that is a great point, that when we think about futures, we need to think about all that comes with African futures. And sometimes that means being accommodating because of ways in which we are perpetually and daily impacted by neocolonialism in all of these multifaceted ways. And I am going to go ahead and share my screen and begin talking about my content. So hopefully folks can see this. I do have a video, so I'll likely be popping in and out of the PowerPoint in order to show my video. Yes. Perfect. Great. So as my title suggests, I'm going to be talking about, will the real AI please stand up? So that's a play on, unfortunately, Eminem's Will the Real Slim Shady Please Stand Up? Well, which actually I did some Googling before this and found out that he technically took that from a game show where they were trying to figure out who the imposter is in the game show. And I think they remade the game show as well into a more recent version, more recently, but we have to uncover this imposter and thinking about who the real AI is. The real AI, in my humble opinion, and in the words of scholar Tony Patrick, is ancestral intelligence, as I will suggest throughout my work. So the traditional formulations of thinking about AI or artificial intelligence is thinking about this definition that I have provided here, which is technically from IBM. And they define artificial intelligence, or AI, as technology that enables computers and machines to simulate human learning, comprehension, problem solving, decision making, creativity, and autonomy. So when I think about artificial intelligence or AI, I think a lot about ChatGPT because of how it has sort of, as I say, taken the world by storm all the way from 2022. And certainly now there's a lot of conversations about academic integrity that's come into the forefront because of ChatGPT, because it is alleged that Gen Z is using a lot of ChatGPT to produce their work, but there's come to the forefront as well a lot of different screening platforms to make sure that they're not using ChatGPT to produce original work, which obviously wouldn't be original if they're using it in that way. And in November 2022, the application of ChatGPT was able to develop human-like responses to the input it received, prompting people to consider the advent and evolution of artificial intelligence and its connection to humans. So, thinking about ways in which artificial intelligence is attempting to formulate these quote-unquote human-like responses needs to be complicated, because how can it be human-like or even close to being human when the human itself is allegedly missing? These are allegedly auto-generated responses. I like to complicate that notion because of what I will talk about momentarily. So of course, this is how ChatGPT looks. A lot of people have been using it. If you have not used the application before, basically, if you type OpenAI into your search bar, it'll populate you to a website that looks pretty similar to this. And if you type, you can ask it anything, you can type anything into it, and it will do various tasks for you. In the future of honesty, or in the tone of honesty, I'll say that I have it type a lot of emails for me, which I'm not always a fan of because I don't necessarily like the way that they word their emails. I do think it sounds like general and generic, but I think sometimes when I just need to like email a student, for example, as per the obligation of my job, sometimes I will use ChatGPT. And I know I'm not the only one using ChatGPT, so I wouldn't say it's fine, but like a lot of people are using it to become more efficient at doing work and getting tasks completed, which we could argue about whether or not that's like the best thing to do. But I think like AI is just taking over all of our landscapes within our quote unquote contemporary world. So like, I don't think that it's something that I see myself no longer using or like stopping to use. I will say it's important to contemplate reducing usage of it because there's been a lot of stories about how it's extracting water from folks in Texas, I believe. So we should contemplate reducing our usage because it is like prompting people not to have water. And that's a really serious issue. But I think people are going to continue to use it regardless, even if it means other people won't have water. And maybe that brings up like a really complicated and complex issue, but also other humans have been getting toxic waste dumped into their communities for decades in Louisiana, and no one's cared about it because they bank on the fact that they can hide environmental degradation, especially when it concerns Black people. And the places that are most heavily impacted by the water or not having water is predominantly Black spaces, which people surprise. I mean, that's not a surprise to anyone. So I don't think people feel compelled to have guilt about not using their AI applications, which is really problematic. I think we have to push ourselves to try to reduce usage or not use it at all. But I think, again, that becomes complicated when the application is still just like on its fifth version since its development. So it's still powering through. I've also followed the trends on ChatGPT because it's something I've researched heavily. And ChatGPT statistically has said that it anticipates something like 500% of growth or something ridiculous like that. So as an application, it knows it's just growing and expanding, and it's going to keep having newer and newer versions because of how much people use it. I think that we have to continue to push and ask questions as folks who study Afrofuturism and things like Afrocentricity to think about the ethical conundrums that come to the forefront when people don't have access to water because of how much these applications are draining the environment. But environmental drainage is nothing new in this neoliberal capitalism world we live in either. So I don't think any of these things are happening in isolation. So that brings us to thinking about none other than Afrofuturism 2.0 and thinking about how we can use that as a framework, or as I say, a mechanistic tool for us to center the human beings whose voices are often forgotten in the homogenous production of neoliberal capitalism. So what I'm suggesting here is that I will get into it later, but there are people who are powering ChatGPT. There are particularly African people in Kenya whose story 60 Minutes highlighted. I'm going to play a clip in a bit, whose they are being exploited to produce knowledge for ChatGPT. Like they are literally, their mind and intellect is literally powering ChatGPT. And so I think Afrofuturism can be used as a tool for us to ask better questions about why those voices are being forgotten. I think when we deconstruct neoliberal capitalism itself and its ties to white supremacy, we know why those voices are being forgotten. But I think Afrofuturism and ways in which it critiques and reformulates understandings of artificial intelligence is a useful framework to rethinking how the voices and labor of African people who power ChatGPT is construed. An Afrofuturist analysis of ChatGPT opens the seams of the algorithm to reveal that some of the looped humans are African, with Kenya being deemed the Silicon Savannah. Imagine Kenya's being deemed the Silicon Savannah when there's many spaces throughout Kenya. I know for sure throughout Tanzania, which is the country that neighbors Kenya, that they have power outages all the time. So how are they calling spaces a Silicon Savannah when they literally are also pushing power outages in these places because they denigrate their power sources to exploit resources? So it's really hypocritical, to say the least, to call Kenya a Silicon Savannah when really it's only a Silicon Savannah because it can be used and exploited for the West. Rather than allegiance to the automated responses by ChatGPT, centering the actualized voices of the Kenyan people in the Silicon Savannah has the potential to produce a word magic that disrupts the confines of silencing and economic disenfranchisement that they have been cast into. So again, rethinking this concept of the Silicon Savannah, but also pushing forward this Bantu notion of Nomo or word magic to suggest that the people in Kenya who are powering ChatGPT are producing a word magic that disrupts the confines that they're being placed into and disrupts the economic disenfranchisement that they have been siphoned into as well. Because as you'll see in the video that I'm going to play, a lot of Kenyan people are unemployed and they have college educations and they're forced to work to help power applications like ChatGPT and what they coined an AI sweatshop, which I'm going to get into my deconstruction of that after we see the video. And they purposely leave Kenyan people economically disenfranchised so that they have no other choice but to work for ChatGPT and ultimately power these applications. So I first got introduced into thinking about how Kenyan people are involved with what's happening in ChatGPT or OpenAI, the company that powers ChatGPT, because of this Times Magazine article that I read in, I believe this was published in 2021. And so I began to present on this information and I presented on it at a Pan-African school that I was teaching at almost a year and a half ago, I believe. And after I presented, the person in charge of the school sent me this video. And I was really shocked, honestly, that 60 Minutes even decided to cover this. But I'm going to chat about this after I play this video. I'm going to stop sharing my screen quickly so that I can reshare so you can hear the sound when I share it. Oh, yes. Perfect. Great.
The familiar narrative is that artificial intelligence will take away human jobs. Machine learning will let cars, computers, and chatbots teach themselves, making us humans obsolete. Well, that's not very likely, and we're going to tell you why. There's a growing global army of millions toiling to make AI run smoothly. They're called humans in the loop. People sorting, labeling, and sifting reams of data to train and improve AI for companies like Meta, OpenAI, Microsoft, and Google. It's grunt work that needs to be done accurately, fast, and to do it cheaply, it's often farmed out to places like Africa.
The story will continue in a moment.
The robots or the machines, you're teaching them how to think like human and to do things like human.
We met Naftali Wambalo in Nairobi, Kenya, one of the main hubs for this kind of work. It's a country desperate for jobs because of an unemployment rate as high as 67% among young people. So Naftali, father of two, college-educated with a degree in mathematics, was elated to finally find work in an emerging field, artificial intelligence. You were labeling.
I did labeling for videos and images.
Naftali and digital workers like him spent 8 hours a day in front of a screen studying photos and videos, drawing boxes around objects and labeling them, teaching the AI algorithms to recognize them.
You label, let's say, furniture in a house, and you say this is a TV, this is a microwave. So you are teaching the AI to identify these items.
Right.
And then there was one for faces of people, the color of the face. If it looks like this is white. If it looks like this is black, this is Asian. You're teaching the AI to identify them.
Right.
Automatically.
Humans tag cars and pedestrians to teach autonomous vehicles not to hit them. Humans circle abnormalities to teach AI to recognize diseases. Even as AI is getting smarter, humans in the loop will always be needed because there will always be new devices and inventions that'll need labeling. You find these humans in the loop not only here in Kenya, but in other countries thousands of miles from Silicon Valley, in India, the Philippines, Venezuela. Often countries with large, low-wage populations, well-educated but unemployed.
Honestly, it's like modern-day slavery because it's cheap labor. It's cheap labor.
Like modern-day slavery, says Narima Wako Ojiwa, a Kenyan civil rights activist, because big American tech companies come here and advertise the jobs as a ticket to the future, but really.
So for the interest of time, I won't show the rest of that video. And also that part really pisses me off when the person who's hosting is like, modern day slavery. I'm like, come on. I know you're playing. So I don't like to give that too much airtime because I think that that's sort of the facet of white journalism that has its limitations. But I think I would highly encourage everyone to see the rest of that video. It's a 13-minute video. It's on YouTube. If you type in 60 minutes ChatGPT, it's pretty much the first thing that will show up. And it pretty much really goes in depth talking to the folks who are powering a lot of these things. I wrote a book chapter all about this that's going to be coming out soon, thinking about how a lot of these countries that she mentioned, thinking about Venezuela, the Philippines, and Kenya, they're seen as being developed because of the advent of ChatGPT, but we see how it's disrupting a lot of Kenyan people's lives and the people whose lived realities get impacted from how they're powering ChatGPT. A lot of people don't believe and don't understand that there are human beings who are providing ChatGPT with information so that it is quote unquote auto-generated. So in reality, it's not auto-generated, and it also relies, arguably, in the words of the Kenyan woman herself, on enslaved labor to power it. So it's really a capitalistic production in that regard, because many aspects of capitalism that have produced American capitalism rest on enslaved labor. So, and that history is oftentimes not thought of as well because America often isn't talking about how its impact or how it has capitalized for decades on enslaved labor. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen one more time and flip through hopefully the rest of these slides. So as you heard her describe in the video, the people who do the work that power these applications are called humans in the loop. But when you go on the Humans in the Loop website, they talk about that they're doing quote unquote ethical work and all of these things, that they're doing quote unquote ethical data labeling, which we saw people pretty much being exploited to power ChatGPT. So we constantly have to problematize these concepts through things like Afrofuturism. So Afrofuturism encourages us to reimagine. It encourages experimentation, reimagining of identities, and activation of liberation using Natasha Womack's work. And it reflects counter histories, hacking, and or appropriating the influence of network software, database logic, cultural analytics, deep remixability, neurosciences, enhancement, and augmentation gender fluidity, post-human possibility, and the speculative sphere with transdisciplinary applications. Pretty much, it provides us with the tools to rethink things like ChatGPT, to ask better questions about what is actually powering ChatGPT. With everything that I know about modern capitalism in America, that it rested on enslaved labor, I also have to ask questions about ChatGPT, and is it truly an auto-generated technology? When we look at that 60 Minutes segment, we know the answer to that is no. And so what I'm suggesting through my title, Will the Real AI Please Stand Up, is that ancestral intelligence rather than artificial intelligence is a true answer, and that ancestral intelligence, through its vast ancestral knowledge, insights, and lived experience, push us to be able to access, to build, create, and live better lives. And I'm pushing forward the idea that the real AI of ancestral intelligence cultivates an Afrofuturistic time-space continuum, because it pushes us to think about how our Kemetic past is present in the present and informs our future. That is the Afrofuturistic time-space continuum that I am relying on. African ancestral intelligence demarcates itself as the hub of technological innovation because the reverberating word of human speech insinuates the wisdom of the ancestors from the past to respond to our present and implicate our futures. Pretty much what I said before, that African people are the Silicon Savannah and have been the Silicon Savannah because of our Kemetic past. We don't need ChatGPT and all of the water drainage that it's brought to spaces like Kenya to tell Kenyan people that they're a Silicon Savannah. The knowledge that African people have always produced since Kemet have pushed it forward as a Silicon Savannah to begin with. And concepts like the Dogon concept of Nomo that has origins in West Africa suggest that all magic is word magic, and that the generation and transformation of sounds contributes to a speaker's power. So in the case of the Kenyan people of the Silicon Savannah, whose minds power the technology of ChatGPT, it is when they speak truth to power about the realities of being economically disenfranchised by tech companies that they evoke the power of their ancestors. And we saw that with the person who is describing how they're essentially living in modern day slavery, although that surprised the person who was hearing about what was happening. I'm not sure how that could have been a surprise, but maybe from her journalistic point of view it was. I'm also suggesting that the ancestral intelligence as the real AI relies on notions of Ma, Ubuntu, and Ujamaa. And what Ma tells us is to center the 7 virtues of Ma, that being truth, justice, propriety, harmony, balance, reciprocity, and order, reinforcing and sustaining the Ma'dian person and society to create a self-enriching process. In other words, the people of Kemet through Ma already had principles for living. They didn't need the West and Western philosophers to tell them about their humanity. That humanity and sensibility was already intrinsic. Their way of knowing through Ubuntu allowed them to understand what it meant to be human and humanness. And last but not least, the concept of Ujamaa, the philosophical practice of advancement of familyhood rooted in a sense of collectivity. They already had not only a collective sensibility, but a sense of humanity and humanness, which operates through them being, not doing in that capitalistic sense. That already was their route to selfhood rather than through the West. So Nomo or word magic operates as a praxis for Afrofuturists. In the remainder of the video, one of the women says, we're humans. Just because we're Black or just because we're vulnerable for now, that doesn't give them the right to just exploit us like this. So the word magic that she speaks contains a sense of empowerment that cannot be auto-generated because it speaks to her actualized human experience. Her words fracture the three-dimensional limitations that neoliberal capitalism has etched onto her body and open up the energetic possibilities of radical imagination that exist beyond the redlining of technology. And in the work of Sophia Noble, she talks about how technology is redlined because of the racism that it implicates. So word magic can be used as a practice for Afrofuturism because Afrofuturism serves as an imaginative practice that envisages the humanity of the Kenyan people as interwoven with the humanity of the people of Kemet and Afrofuturism, seen and unseen. I'm going to wrap us there. But that is my presentation. So I'm going to open the floor for questions. I also have the our colleague from South Africa. I have his film. Hopefully the link that he emailed me works, but I'm going to play that after the presentation if there are questions. Someone asked.
Connie.
Oh, perfect. Yep.
Everything's all right. I access the laptop so I can screen for my space.
Okay, perfect.
Yeah, I told it. Sorry. Hence, I was saying our individual stories, even your stories, are telling me on a daily experiences, we live this Afrofuturism. It's not something in the future.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
So I have a question.
There's also a question in the chat, so I'm going to go for that question first since it popped in the chat first. So someone asks, are humans in the loop labeling through a Eurocentric lens? I think that's debatable because I don't know, we can't necessarily extrapolate the lens that they're labeling in, but we can argue that it is Eurocentric that they have to label to begin with because it's rooted in capitalism and it's rooted in neoliberal capitalist production that exploits the global South. So I would argue that the labeling itself is an act of Eurocentrism implicating itself on Black bodies. You can go ahead and ask your question. Sorry about that.
Sure, Courtney. Sure. My belief is like there's this thing called BC and AC called before chat and after chat, right? So in Africa, AI, the traditional healer, has been a sort of an AI because you consult them with one word and they tell you a whole different story. Né? So here in South Africa, in the township, in the informal spaces, so I'm in my township, in the ghettos, we sometimes have ciphers. We talk about cosmologies, but not in the academic way, and they were not recorded, were not being archived, you know?
Right.
Yeah, and some of the things we are talking about relates to our own lived experience. So now there's a light bulb in my mind, which we're actually connected more than we think we are in the diaspora and our cosmologies
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that AC and BC is a really interesting concept. Like that's something I'm going to be thinking about for sure, because I'm really interested into what the transformation of ChatGPT is going to have on human life. So I think ChatGPT needs to like exist more before we can really like say ACBC for sure. But it's already having such profound impacts that like ACBC for sure exists. And I think it'll be interesting to see how it continues to evolve and attempt to replicate this like human-like feature.
And the last year I was part of a project with the French embassy called November Numerique. I came up with the concept of using AI, but I call it AI with a plus and AI with the negative at the top. So it's AI with the plus and AI with the negative. So the plus is for positive uses, decolonization uses. We're using it for decolonization. The negative part are the prompts of Trump, this internet consumption of negative XXX stuff. So you get to use that. You can use AI for the positive uses, for utopian imaginaries. And then there's the negative part where it becomes draining, it's extractive. The people in Kenya are getting used. But at the end of the day, we need to catch on and be early adapters because the West, if it catches on and the global South is behind, as we're shooting ourselves in the foot. So we need to counteract how they train the machines with the Western knowledge and stuff.
Right.
Yeah. So I'm ready to screen the film, ne?
Yeah, go for it. You should be able
Yeah,
to share your screen.
share my. I'll start my video. No, should I start my video? Share my screen.
You should share your screen first and then start your video.
Okay.
And if
Share
you have
screen.
trouble with sharing your screen, I have the email and I can try it as well.
I'm good. I'm good. Can you see something now?
Yeah, I see you. Yeah.
Okay. So I want to go to my files, ne? Go to my files. No. I want to go to I'm gonna minimize okay, this is me, guys. Sharp. Yo. Okay, I wanna minimize this screen and go to okay. I found the film, Courtney. Now I'm going back to Zoom. Where's the share screen? Where's my share
Yeah,
screen?
if you hover your cursor over the bottom, you'll see that green box that says share underneath it. You're gonna hit that and it should start sharing it.
Oh yeah, share screen. I've got it in the tab. Can you see my screen now?
No, not yet. No.
Not yet. Okay, let me check something out. Okay, I'm going back. Wait. Okay, give me a sec. You can see me, not my screen.
Yeah, still not just
Now? Oh, wait. I saw something.
Yeah, there we go.
Now?
I see.
Okay.
Yeah, I see it.
You can see my screen. Okay, I'm gonna go to the files. Hey, Sister Courtney, man. We are here in Africa. These tools, hey, we're building a spaceship while it's in motion, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I did not have electricity. Now I'm screening. So everybody has the film. Okay, wait. Let me go back to Zoom.
No, we see you. You could go ahead and keep playing, doing what you was doing.
So you are can you see my screen?
Yeah, we see your screen. Just hit the film. Just hit the QuickTime. Go down to your QuickTime. Don't hit Zoom. Go back to your QuickTime. It was opening in QuickTime, the film.
Okay, on the QuickTime. Okay.
Yeah. There we go.
Can see the film?
Yeah, we can see it. Go ahead and press play.
Thank you.
So when you hit share screen, you have to hit share sound as well, or we won't be able to hear it.
Where is it?
You have to stop the share and reshare it again.
Okay,
so stop your share, which if you float your cursor on the top, perfect.
Yeah.
So then you're gonna hit share screen again, and on the side to your right, you're gonna see two check boxes that says share sound and optimize sound. You're going to hit both of those boxes, and then finish the share. Perfect.
Okay.
Now,
but
play
it's not
we see the video. You could just go ahead and play it.
Sound?
Is there sound in that beginning portion? I didn't hear it, but
Courtney?
I have the Cyber Zama video. Can I go ahead and share my screen and at least play that?
Yes. Wait, can you share your screen and show me how you share your screen?
Okay. You won't be able to see how I share my screen though. That's the thing. You'll only be able to see the final product. But I can
I've got it. I got it.
Perfect. There we go.
Thank you for your patience.
Of course.
Now, can you see the video?
I see the video, but you'll have to play it to see if we can hear it. Yeah.
Sutri of the interstellar Bantu has been a well-kept secret for thousands of years. Past, present and future, they are us, here now, everywhere space traveling. The revolution of the Milky Way galaxy begun in South Africa. It's a living in real-time history, the children of the stars Azani on Mars. Outer space freedom unlimited, we come to take you home. Time travel, stop sleeping, time to space travel.
Apartheid in South Africa crumbled after Nelson Mandela walked to freedom, but black people suffered decades of government-backed injustice before it did. Apartheid really began in 1948, but separating black Africans from the white minority had long been a policy aim. Laws made white people officially superior, and the large black majority faced discrimination in every aspect of their lives. Living, doing business or owning land in white areas was banned. There were separate public facilities, transport and schools. Interracial marriage was banned. Many had no right to citizenship and were regarded as aliens in major cities. Instead, they were made citizens of Bantustans, homelands scattered throughout South Africa. But resistance grew. In 1960, a huge peaceful protest against past laws ended in a massacre at Sharpeville. 69 people were killed. The deaths galvanized opposition, radicalizing liberation movements like the ANC.
And many people feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence.
Open conflict erupted in the 1980s, with anti-apartheid activists frequently shot at, beaten or arrested. Mass protests were firmly put down. But little by little, the apartheid establishment crumbled. After gradual reform, Nelson Mandela, imprisoned since not long after Sharpeville, was set free in 1990. 4 years later, he was elected as South Africa's first black president. Apartheid had ended.
In the twilight of an era, when the dawn of a new world was just beginning to break over the land, the Bantu people, those whose roots stretched deep into the soil of ancient earth, were called, not only by the ancestors, but by those who had watched over them, looking deep into their suffering and pain in silence from beyond the stars. The year is 1990, the reality of not having access to land, the frustration and exclusion felt by the people who continue to struggle on a daily basis. No access to water, shelter and the benefits of the city. A small elite continue to own land. The new government owns huge portions of the land, which is often occupied by the unknown 10%. The Natives Land Act effectively prohibited black people from owning land in South Azania. The effects of overpopulation are crippling, The townships have no land, only houses cramped together like prison cells. The people need land and access to the city, but as the veil of oppression lifts, a new force awakens. An ancient power, buried in the stars, has begun its long-awaited return.
One of the things that is difficult for me to comprehend is that we spent such a long time here. And there were moments of joy. But of course, there were painful moments because the apartheid regime was an expert in persecuting people psychologically.
Mandela always said he came out of prison a different man. What was it about life on Robben Island that changed him?
Well, you know, the fact that you could sit alone and think gave us a wonderful opportunity to change ourselves, your behavior. I felt quite ashamed because I became busy with politics and with law. And I forgot that the people were very kind to me when I arrived in Johannesburg. And I said,
We were very, very scared. The police were saying, whether you like it or not, you will be moved.
Under the Group Areas Act, the attempt is now to separate out your Cape Coloured people, your mixed bloods, your Indian group, your African group. This is apartheid. Your states are being apart.
Sophiatown was the very first population removal. 60 to 70,000 people were pulled out of their homes by force. Their homes were bulldozed behind them.
I was born and bred here in Sophiatown. It was called Little Harlem. We had jazz, we had gangsters, you had dancing clubs where people would dance against each other. There was so much going on in Sophiatown that the birds had to fly backwards to keep the dust from their eyes. We had all nationalities. We had Zulus, Chinese, Indians, and we lived in harmony together. It was also unique because people could own property, and it was unusual because the whites didn't want people to own the land.
The more that legislation for apartheid is pushed through Parliament, the greater the opposition aroused among the Africans.
They wanted us to be moved far away from town so that they can take Sophiatown and turn it into a white suburb. People fought that they should stay here because they were here first. So if the government wants to move us, they will have to do so by force. We had just finished having supper when we had a big knock at the door. They came with these big government trucks. They would come late, load everything onto the trucks while the soldiers and the police were standing there with guns. And you know, as a child, they seem huge. And then after it was loaded, they told us, "Clement the truck. You just have to follow the rules, what they were saying, so that nobody in your family gets injured or killed." They told us that they are taking us to a new house in Meadowlands. Utla makua ari yengo Meadowlands, 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 Meadowlands indawo yami. In those days, there was no electricity. It was pitch black. So you didn't know where you were. They said, "This is your home, so you can take your furniture in." Meadowlands goes from zone 1 to zone 10. If you are Zulu, you would be put in the Zulu zone.
All of a sudden, they just went out of their cars and came advancing towards us. The first white policeman threw a tear gas It was the first time we saw a tear gas can. We didn't know even what it was. So when we saw it emitting smoke, we dispersed. And when we came back again. Maybe we thought they would talk to us through a loudspeaker or something like that. All of a sudden, the same policeman who threw the tear gas canister opened fire on the students. I saw a boy of about 11 going down under police fire. I could not believe it. Apparently, when Hector was shot, the students ran back, and I was left with Hector and a girl. I was feeling scared, and I wanted to run away too. And this policeman was aiming his gun at Hector again.
Began quietly a series of strange unexplained lights in the sky over the Johannesburg skyline and surrounding townships. At first the government dismisses it as a hoax or a military experiment, but soon inexplicable phenomena began to occur. Electric grid failed the electricity switching off every night and day. Government officials continue with corruption. Strange sounds echo throughout the townships. The government continues its relentless crackdown on anti-apartheid movements, but however, something darker is unfolding. Spaceships descend on the Johannesburg outskirts. They hover over key historical landmarks and tribal villages, drawing attention of local residents. Isolated communities in the townships did not panic. They held community meetings with the Stella Bantu. For a time they conduct strange experiments, probing human emotions, fears and responses. The Stella Bantu use psychic abilities to communicate with the people. They called themselves the Stella Bantu, visitors from a distant world which has its ancient roots in southern Africa. Arriving with promises of salvation, the people are living in inhumane conditions. The mass population in the township is a sign that its inhabitants are oppressed. The Stella Bantu tell the community that space travel is the only solution from such unlivable conditions they face in the townships for decades. The arrival of the Stella Bantu is a curse or a blessing. They came with knowledge of the land, of the stars. They spoke of a future where the people would be free of the chains of the oppressors and be the children of the stars. To save the people, they would need to destroy the townships and abduct the people to join them in their intergalactic freedom fighters movement. They taught the people, gave them new ways of cultivating the earth, and spoke of a greater war than apartheid, one that would take place between the unknown 10%. The alien oppressors disguised as government officials and the children of earth, a war that would decide the fate of South Africans living in the townships. As the years passed, the war against the unknown 10% aliens began. The people of the township were not just victims of apartheid, but conquerors and soldiers in a cosmic battle, bound by blood, planets and stars. is not just what we see, it is what we have forgotten. And it is only in remembering that we can understand what comes next. Historical reality of land reform. Oppression needs deeper reflection on power, colonization, and the cyclical nature of the past, present, and future. For centuries, our people were told they came from this land, from these valleys, from these rivers. But the truth was hidden from them. They were born to wander scattered across the Milky Way galaxy. And now the time has come for them to return to the stars. South Africans are the first people on Mars, but not already. The fear of leaving what we know, what we have fought for, is too great. Our hearts are torn between the land we have cultivated and the call of an ancient interstellar lineage and heritage.
Started a very rich and engaging dialogue and debate in the nation on how we can deal with the issue of land. And clearly, in the course of doing so, we are also going to be looking at those in the region and in the world who have dealt with the question of land and how best they have done so. So we're going to be drawing some examples, some lessons from Zimbabwe and a number of other countries. So our debate and discussion is going to continue until it matures to a very firm position, which will then be adopted by our national parliament. So right now, it's an exciting moment in our country.
luhlukana kanjaba uhlukana wombelebele bahluke emanxulumeni baze kwasamanxuluma esebikelana ilembe lekamalembe yabo ngokukhalipha unodumehle sikamenzi sishaka sishayeki umntaka senza ngakhona ushaka ngesaba lokuthi mshaka ushaka kwakwinkosi yasemashobeni uteku lwabafazi babonomgabi ababelutekula behleze emlovini bethi ushaka kayibusa bathi kayikwenkosi kanti kulephesa unethe sebakhona umlilo wothathe yabo kamjokwana umlilo wothathe basho bangamu bashisa ikhova yabo isedlebe base kwayikwasha yayisemabedlana inkomo ekhale emthonjaneni izizwe zonke sisilukulila obizwe ngidunjwa basoyengweni yesomencekeza engwakwakhali bakhaphele ezansi yabona amathumelo inkomo zawusayo yabazamlandela yekwalandela yezomhlomosi esayisemendiki kwakwamaphela ogangembe yamabele ngakadliwa ogangembisa amasongololo bampheka ngembisa ebipheka amakhosi yabakwantombasi kafuthi ushaka kaqengwa wayilanda inkomo yayilanda umakhedamba kwasekhakunina izulu elidumeta komfisi ekubekeni bathatha isihlanu esamaphela wadlula umadladlana ezalwa nguswide emapheleni wadlula unqabeni ezalwa nguswide emapheleni wadlula umpepha ezalwa nguswide emapheleni wadlula umpondo kunale kwasinde emapheleni wadlula udayingubo ezalwa nguswide emapheleni wadlula umbengula ezalwa nguswide emapheleni wadlula umntimona ezalwa ngugaqa emapheleni wadlula umdadlazi ezalwa
Thank you so much for sharing that piece. As I'm sure you saw, the chat was buzzing the entire time about all the interesting content and I think conversation your fantastic film, I think, brings to the table. It's really insightful and I think prompts a lot of inquisitions about thinking about notions of land and a myriad of different themes. You can go ahead and unmute yourself if you want to begin responding to some of the things in the chat, or if you just would like to, in general, discuss what we saw.
Can I present the slides of what we saw?
How many slides is it?
10.
In the interest of time, I'm going to say no, just because the film itself was 20 minutes. But if you could, I'm going to try and share the other film that you sent me with Walter Greason, who's also like running all of this. So hopefully the other film could get sent out. If you also want your slides to be sent out as well, I can definitely do that.
Yeah, because I'm ready for the questions. Looking at the message. Okay,
all right, yeah.
So the call of the ancient interstellar lineage, right? So in South Africa, the word Zulu means space. It might mean a race. It might mean a race of people in South Africa, but it actually means space. The word Zulu means to travel. So these two words, it means space travel. So our ancestors knew about space travel with these two words, and these two words are related. Zulu ends with the U, Zula ends with the A. So Zulu essentially becomes space travel. When I was doing my research, reading about Credo Mutwa, I came with a concept called Luzwimodi, a savior of the Bantu race who's going to be born in the distant future. He wrote this book in the 1970s. So in South Africa, some of the most enlightened people, enlightened shamans, traditional healers, they know of this concept of the Luzwimodi, the one who's going to be born in the far future. So in my mind, I was thinking there might be ancestral lineage in outer space that will come back and reclaim us, because the concept was all about land. In South Africa, Black people don't have land. So this land issue, even today, is still an issue in my generation. So when I was talking about this, I was talking about maybe our land is on planet Mars, but in the concept of Frans Fanon, it becomes the new human. So Blacks in the diaspora, we have an opportunity to create the new human by telling the world about the cosmologies of the world. Because in the world, they usually talk about the countries and their individual lives, but we never talk about our placement as humanity in the planet. And Afrofuturism can be a tool of re-educating people about the imagined futures and the imagined past. Because in the past, we are much aware there were ancient contacts with extraterrestrials, but the North is hiding that information for the rest of humanity. By using art, we're enlightening humanity so that they are aware of the star seed. Hence, one of the person wrote in the chats. And it's also the issues of land. And in South Africa, we still can't address the issues of land. So it becomes part of speculative fiction based in Africa, you know? So my concept was to make Black people in the diaspora be aware that as people in Africa, we are also part of the Afrofuturistic movement, but we call it indigenous knowledge. More or less, the people in the diaspora using Afrofuturism, they are usually indigenous healers, because the information that they even me growing up, learning about Saul Williams, the work of Reynaldo Anderson, inspired me to think about Afrofuturism from the continent. How can I reinterpret their learnings of Saul Williams, Reynaldo Anderson from the continent and create a new niche or a new genre of Afrofuturism based in the continent. So this becomes a lived experience, because in the ghettos, in the township, there are some times where people get abducted, but it does not become part of the news. Even during apartheid, people used to see UFOs in the township, but those things were not reported. So as Black people, we need to be conscious that we are in contact with extraterrestrial intelligences, but they're not. We only talk about NASA and all those things. But as Black people, indigenous people, the Dogon people, the people in Mapungubwe, and I had a suggestion of the future waves coming to South Africa in the next editions, because we feel like we're being left out. The diaspora always focuses on West Africa. Even me here in South Africa, I want to learn about the diaspora, but from the West, but in South African essence, because in South Africa, there was not a lot of history of the Atlantic, but culturally, we are one thing, and sometimes we feel like we're being left out, because these things always happen in West Africa. And we also need the Black Speculative Arts Movement to also focus in South Africa and host events, because there's a movement in South Africa. We can integrate each other's works, then we can build something more continental. Thank you for this opportunity very much.
And thank you so much for your presentation and for showing us that awesome film and bringing us into the Zula world. I didn't know that that was space travel. I think that's really quite a genius concept, honestly. All right. Technically, as of today, that is a wrap for all of our sessions. Thank you so much for everyone who joined. I'm going to stop with the recording right now.